Good evening, everyone. My name is Claudia Beamish MSP, and as a Director of Scotland's Futures Forum, I'm delighted to welcome you all to the Scottish Parliament and to this Futures Forum event, looking at the future of rural Scotland. And the focus for this event, as I say, is the future of rural Scotland, in particular, the challenge of building a shared vision that encompasses both sustainable community development and the conservation we need to protect our environment. We have an excellent, wonderful panel to discuss these questions, but before I introduce them, we have a couple of introductions to the event from our partners from this evening's event, the Royal Society of Edinburgh's Young Academy of Scotland. First, to say a little about the work of the Young Academy from her position as a leading young researcher in ecology. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Leslie Lancaster. Thank you.
There we go. Okay, it's a pleasure to be here tonight for this event. So yes, I'm Leslie Lancaster, so I'm an ecologist and an evolutionary biologist, and I'm on the faculty of the University of Aberdeen. I moved to Scotland in 2013, and I would say, like many of Scotland's international residents, I came here with expectations and being already enamored with Scotland's magnificent countryside and with its inclusive culture. And I would say 6 years on into living here, I'm still quite impressed. So in my research at the University of Aberdeen, I study species responses to climate change and to changes in land use. So we look at how species are moving in response to temperature change in the climate, and we also look at how land use changes affects the composition of communities and what the consequences might be for those over the long term. So this kind of research topic is certainly well rooted in the concept of ecological sustainability in terms of how biodiversity is changing and how the services provided by that biodiversity might be changing. But my research is often quite removed from the additional complexities of the wider human dimensions of the sustainability concept in general. And so in order to sort of gain and contribute to this wider perspective, I joined the Young Academy of Scotland back in 2016. So this organization was founded in 2011 under the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And it consists of professionals, academics, artists, entrepreneurs, and civil servants, all of which, as given by the term young, are relatively early career, and which have evidenced an ambition and an ability to sort of transcend their individual roles, to come together to create a wider voice to address issues in Scotland and beyond. So the topic of sustainability is one of the major themes underpinning much of the Young Academy's work. It forms a core component of the Young Academy's strategic plan. And so there's been a number of events that the Young Academy has hosted along this theme. And according to the website, if you go to the Young Academy website and look and see what the work has been, the definition of sustainability that's given there is that it's the process of empowering communities and enabling access to expertise. Now, this is a very different definition from sustainability from what an ecologist would use. So I would define sustainability as the long-term persistence, resilience, or stability of a group of organisms and the functions that they fulfill in an ecosystem. So I think part of the challenge moving forward will be to develop a more holistic definition of or concept of sustainability that encompasses both natural and human dimensions. And I hope this dialogue will be productive in promoting a sustainable future for Scotland in some way, big or small. Thank you.
A really inspiring start. And if we can tonight actually come up with a definition of sustainability that involves human and natural fusion, I think we'll be doing very well. But you've set us quite a few challenges, so thank you. And now to provide some further context for our discussion, I'm delighted to invite Dr. Chris Dalgleish, a former fellow of the Young Academy, to share the results of new research conducted by the Institute of Heritage and Sustainable Human Development with Community Land Scotland. So thank you and welcome.
a fair amount of the work we do is with the heritage of land and landscape, that kind of common inheritance of land and landscape, and how that might feature in rural development. And part of this is the research I'd just like to reflect on as a contribution to the discussion this evening, Community Empowerment Landscape, which was published last year jointly by ourselves and Community Land Scotland. I suppose the issue that sparked off this investigation is the contention that Scotland's current landscape conservation policies are acting as a barrier to the development that's needed for people to be able to sustain and grow their rural communities. So that was the issue we set out to investigate and to stand back and take a look at the evidence to support or not that contention. We asked three main questions. Excuse me if I turn around. What are the effects of landscape policy on a community's ability to develop is the first one. I should say at this point, I'm using landscape policy as a kind of a shorthand for policies in three areas: natural heritage, historic environment, and landscape, which in policy terms really has the meaning of natural beauty and amenity. So I'm referring to all of that when I say landscape policy for short. So what are the effects of that, those groups of policies on people's ability to develop as rural communities? Can people take part in decisions about how their local landscapes are understood, conserved and developed? And what should be the future in terms of participation and decisions about the conservation and development of our landscapes? So that's a bit of a critique, but here today we're looking towards the future, that vision of where we should be going in the future with these issues of conservation and development, and the practice, the steps in practice that will get us there. Again, we reflected on this in the report. It was the third question: where do we go in the future? And I think the conclusions we drew on this can be summed up by what one of our interviewees for the research said, which is that what we really need is a redefinition of the public interest in this context, one which marries conservation on the one hand with the sustainable development of communities and the promotion of human rights on the other. And these are the kind of elements that we need for that vision. And we already have a lot of those ingredients in our policy and our legal frameworks. Sustainable development is very well recognised as a principle, as we've been hearing, and it's very much in all of these areas of policy that I've been talking about. But of course, it means different things to different people, as you were saying, Leslie. So let me just define it the way we did in the report and the way I see it, and maybe with reference to three key points. Firstly, sustainable development is about development, and development is change. So we're talking here about change as being an inherent part of what we should be doing. Secondly, sustainable development is about people. Development is about people. It's about promoting, improving people's well-being and quality of life. But of course, to be sustainable, that has to happen in a way which supports rather than destroys the environment, and which is also socially just, so sustainable in social terms. And finally, for development to be sustainable, people need to take part, and not just take part in the decisions, but actually become agents of change, so have an active role in conceptualising and delivering the development that we're talking about. And that means people need to have the opportunity to grow their abilities and the chance to use them. Let me just finish, though, with talking about the practice, about well, what do we do with all that and where do we go with it. Again, we looked at this in the research. We asked people, and we looked at the sort of written evidence for the kinds of practices which would lead us to that future. What came through quite strongly is a certain model of practice, or let's say a kind of constellation of models, because it's quite varied, which people on the community side and on the public sector side were kind of keen to promote as the way forward. Certainly this model has empowerment within it. That's one of the key things we need to think about. But this is not just about offloading responsibilities onto communities. The kinds of examples we were given that I think give reality to this model are where we, for instance, where we have community landowners like in Egg and Knoydart in North Harris, which is the picture on the screen, where on the board of the community landowning body you have representatives of local government and of conservation NGOs like the Scottish Wildlife Trust or the John Muir Trust. So you have a structural partnership or collaboration there between conservation, community and other interests. Other examples we given were more projects rather than structures, like the North Harris Eagle Observatory, again on the screen, where you have a particular project delivered which has community development and conservation aims at the heart of it, and is developed and delivered in partnership between a community organisation and others, public bodies, conservation NGOs and so on. And finally, we were given lots of examples of designations in inverted commas, which combine community development and conservation, so national parks, UNESCO geoparks and biospheres, for example, and again, which tend to operate through collaboration and partnership in different ways. Now, that's a very diverse group of examples, but when you stand back from them, they share a lot of features and characteristics, which are what I think people were trying to point to. It's what a development theorist might refer to as place-based development and a network development, or place-based conservation, if you like, as well. The features of the model are it tries to deliver local benefit and wider benefit at the same time. It works through capacity building, so people in the locality become the agents of change, the agents of development, and the agents of conservation as well. It's all about local assets, which should be conserved for the future, but are also the basis of development, the land, the landscape, the natural environment, and the people of the place. And it's networked. It's not bottom-up, purely speaking. It's networked in the sense that success tends to come where you have local assets and local empowerment combined with external resources like funding and external expertise all working together. And if that can be made to work, that's when we tend to see things happening well. Now, that model is fairly well known in Scotland, both in theory, it's talked about in a lot of different policy areas, for example, and we have examples in practice, as I've said. I think the issue is, and perhaps something to think about for this evening, is that in practice it's confined to those examples. So perhaps the one thing we might think about doing is making that normal, and how do we do that? And that's no doubt challenging, but perhaps that's the way we have to go. Thank you very much.
So we're going to hear from our panel now, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce them. On my far left, we have Mcginnis, Scottish Land Commissioner, and next to her is Jack Norquay, who is a member of the Scottish Youth Parliament for Orkney, island and rural. Sorry to state the obvious, but very important that you're here with us. And next to Jack is Callum MacLeod from Community Land Scotland. You're very welcome as well. And now next to me is Vicky Swells from RSPB Scotland, who is this evening appearing on behalf of Scottish Environment Link. Could I turn to you first, Megan, to reflect on Chris's presentation and give us something of your own vision for the future, just to put you on the spot? That would be great.
Thanks, Claudia. Good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. So I'm one of 6 Scottish Land Commissioners. I live in Applecross. I work part-time with the international NGO Global Witness and work on the croft the rest of the time. And I have about almost 20 years' experience working on land reform, community land rights, and natural resource governance in Asia, but also within these international systems that Chris has just mentioned, these human rights systems. So the Scottish Land Commission is one of the newest NDPBs formed. We've just been formed a couple of years ago. We've been tasked by the Scottish Government to drive land reform forward. Our current programme of work has 4 work streams, all of which very much relate to this conversation. Our scope is to look at both rural and urban land reform, but I'll try and focus on the rural issues for tonight. So the first of those work streams is around increasing land available for housing and development. The second looks at increasing the diversity of land ownership. The third looks at how to improve opportunities for communities to engage in decision making around land. And then the fourth is the agricultural holdings work stream, which looks at trying to improve relationships between tenant farmers and landowners. From our perspective, land reform is really at the heart of the discussions and the vision for a future of rural Scotland, a future of Scotland as a whole. Our vision, the Land Commission's vision, is to make more of Scotland's land for its people, for its environment, and for its economy. We see this very much as requiring a more inclusive, a more productive, and a more fair way of owning, managing, and using land. And we certainly need to be using all of those tools if we're going to be able to address some of the real critical issues which are coming up in rural areas of Scotland, particularly around the lack of access to affordable housing and the quite catastrophic projected population declines that some groups have talked about, particularly in sparsely populated areas. The other thing I just wanted to quickly say was reflect on Chris's presentation, because I've worked at the international level where Scotland is not unique in terms of facing some tensions from both at the level of policy and at practice in terms of how to bring together conservation and ecological objectives with social and development and community objectives. There's 25 years worth of evidence now in research which suggests very strongly that conservation models which exclude local communities not only have a negative impact on those communities directly, but also undermine their own conservation objectives. We're seeing now the coming together through the institutions of the Convention on Biological Diversity and the World Parks Congress, which is a meeting every year of the international conservation community, who have begun to develop new paradigms which try to redress and rebalance the conservation objectives with community objectives, using human rights and sustainable development goals as the framework for that. It's really interesting because there's lots of parallels with what Chris has just presented. The objective of this new paradigm is to move away from seeing communities as a problem or a challenge to conservation, but to see them as the agents of change, see them as part of the solution, recognise the value that local people, indigenous communities, customary communities are already playing in, not only in terms of achieving local conservation goals, but helping to mitigate against the climate change and these much bigger global issues. So I think there's a huge amount, as usual, that Scotland can show internationally, but also can learn from in terms of these policies and methodologies and these global discussions, which are very much echoing the national debate. So I just wanted to finish by saying I'm really excited to be here, not just because I'm a bit of a land reform geek, but because this directly impacts on the community I live in. But it's also very much, we're seeing the stars aligning from the practice, the policy, and the legislative perspective. And I think there's some real opportunities now to move the discussions forward and develop that vision together. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. Could I ask Jack for you to give your initial response and observations? That would be great.
Absolutely. Now, when I was thinking about what I was going to say, I was remembered on a few occasions in Orkney at events that I've been at, people have told me a bit of a saying that our biggest export is our young people. And that really resonated with me because, you think of Orkney as being this place, and indeed the rest of the Highlands and Islands region being a producer of, fine foods and fine culture and services. But actually, in terms of sustainable development, young people must absolutely be at the heart of that. Young people must be at the heart of decision making in their communities on all these topics that we're discussing tonight. If we can build a strong foundation in the next generation, that will have almost a trickle-down effect and ensure that progress that we're making as being alighted to holds up. Now, on this idea of a vision of a future of a sustainable rural Scotland, I'm going to cite a lot of evidence from Highlands and Islands Enterprise. They've done a lot of research. Last year they interviewed about 5,000 young people living across the region, and a lot of is quite interesting statistics. So reasons to be positive. Some of them, 55% of young people are committed to staying in the region. That is up from 2015. So that kind of suggests that there perhaps is a progress there. 69% of young people feel they are lucky to live in the Highlands. I absolutely consider myself a part of that. But there's also a flip side. 87% of young people think they have to compromise in order to live, work or study in the Highlands and Islands. 76% think there's fewer jobs. A big issue is on career progression. You can get employment, but can you get a career out of it? Can you progress in that? It's again another thing. And big issues, as was being highlighted about affordable housing. 93% of young people believe that having access to good quality and affordable housing is absolutely crucial for them staying in rural Scotland, and that is a very, very high percentage. I think out of the research that is the highest percentage. So Scotland is due to incorporate the United Nations Convention of the Rights of the Child, and Article 12 of that convention, that young people have the right to express their opinions and they have the right to be involved in decision making over issues that affect them. That can be here in the Scottish Parliament, but that can also go right down into local communities, into local councils, community councils, ensuring that young people are part of the policy making, that they can have a say. So we call that the human rights-based approach, and to that there's 5 key things to that. There's legality, there's participation, meaningful participation. So we want to move away from kind of tick box exercises. Oh yes, we've consulted with young people, we can move on, but actually involve them in the process right the way through. Accountability, non-discrimination, equality, and probably most importantly, empowerment. So empowering local communities has been mentioned to make a lot of these decisions over how they make their own communities more sustainable. And I think finally, to conclude, I mentioned about incorporation, so we have an opportunity here with the incorporation of the United Nations Convention for the Rights of the Child to really transform. There's been a lot of really good progress in recent years of how the Scottish Government is engaging with young people in policy making, and again, the incorporation of the Convention, I think it's another reminder to ensure that young people are a part of these decision makings over the issues that we're discussing.
Thank you. We're looking for expertise, but also looking for wisdom, and that was a very wise perspective, so thank you. And we move seamlessly to Callum. Thank you for your introductory remarks.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Community Land Scotland is an organisation that was formed in 2010. We, unsurprisingly, represent community landowners throughout urban and rural Scotland. We were formed at a point when the political momentum, it seemed, had somewhat dissipated from land reform as a public policy issue in Scotland. I don't think, given the fact the Land Commission exists now, the fact that, as Chris mentioned, there's legislation and other mechanisms in place, that you could say that now. So land, which I'll touch upon briefly in a few moments, is critically important in terms of all this. But it's very easy to throw concepts or mention concepts like empowerment and sustainability into the ether and think that we all agree with what they mean and what they are. And the reality, of course, is that we don't necessarily. Sustainable development, sustainability is a contested term. Empowerment is a nice idea, and when it works in practice, that's very good. But what does that mean? And what are the challenges associated with that? And Chris has mentioned, and again, Community Land Scotland was very pleased to collaborate with Inherit in relation to this particular piece of research, that there are significant gaps and issues around participation and empowerment for communities in practice. Climate change is an existential threat. It's the existential threat to us all. In rural Scotland, there are existential threats for communities as well. Their right to be is being threatened by exactly the kind of things that Jack mentioned in terms of population decline and issues around how they are made sustainable, how they achieve sustainability. I come from the Isle of Harris originally. Back in the 1990s, the way in which Harris's declining population was going to be addressed in terms of economic prosperity and development was through the creation of a super quarry in 1989-90. Not far from the croft where I grew up, actually, the Rogneval, which is in the bays of Harris, the east side of Harris. One size does not fit all in terms of development. And then that begs the question, well, what are we talking about? If we're talking about ideas of place-based development, what might that mean? And how might we marry the economic, social, environmental, and cultural aspects of sustainable development together in relation to what that might mean in practice? And a great deal of that, not all of it, but actually does come down to the land issue as the basic resource of production, but also so much more. And if we're talking about land as an agent, as a mechanism for sustainable development, well, clearly issues of who owns land and how they use it are inextricably linked. And I will come back to the kind of issue of repopulation that Jack, you mentioned so eloquently in terms of your own presentation. Research by the James Hutton Institute from last year has very, very gloomy is underplaying it somewhat. Projections with regard to the population of what they term Scotland's sparsely populated areas, which take up about 48% of Scotland's landmass, but contain only 2.9% of Scotland's population. But where does that leave the communities of Harris and the bays of Harris, where a super quarry was a solution 20 years ago? Where does that leave the other communities that are losing their youth over time and not replacing them in terms of getting people back in to add to the vitality and capacity of these communities? And what role does public policy, a rights-based approach, and land reform in its very broadest sense have to play in all of this? Well, Community Land Scotland would say, of course, has a very significant part to play in this. But I'm sure there are other views around the room too, and I'm very interested to see where the debate might take us. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. I'm really avoiding commenting, which I'm very tempted to do just in terms of time, so I'm going to go straight to Vicky, which is another very significant part of the puzzle, what you're going to explore with us. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Claudia. As Claudia said, I work for RSPB Scotland, but I'm here today representing Scottish Environment Link, which is the umbrella body of environmental NGOs in Scotland. And so a key question for us is, what are some of the pathways that get us where we need to be in environmental terms to meet those big challenges of climate and biodiversity in ways which actually help to create vibrant rural communities, good jobs and opportunities for everyone? And I just want to throw out a few things that we'd like to see happen in the next, well, some of them pretty immediately, but that might help us to get there. The first thing is to properly implement something called Scotland's Land Use Strategy, which came out of the Climate Change 2009 Act, and progress has completely stalled. It's got some great objectives, high-level principles about how we need to use land in much smarter, more integrated ways to deliver multiple benefits for us, but we haven't made progress. We were supposed to establish regional partnerships, create regional land use frameworks, which were kind of indicative land use plans, and do that by engaging local communities and the people on the ground as to what were the opportunities and what were the constraints in the Highlands and Islands or Argyll and Bute or in each of the regions of Scotland. So that would be number one. We need to get on and do that. As part of that, we'd like to see the establishment of what we're calling a national ecological network. And that's basically a network of those key sites and areas with protected areas at their heart. We make no bones about that. But those areas that can actually help nature's recovery and ultimately help us as well as people and society because of those services that they're going to provide for us. They're going to store carbon like peatlands, or woodlands, or pollinators, for example. I'm very conscious of time. A couple of quick more things. I think we would like to see a major overhaul of how we use public money in Scotland's rural areas. We'd like to retain the current levels of public investment. So currently about £650 million going into Scotland's rural areas through the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy. But we need to reshape how we spend that money. We need to repurpose it. We need to focus it on delivering those public goods and services that the market doesn't provide and doesn't reward landowners and land managers for producing currently. We need to make sure that we invest in supporting activities like research and knowledge transfer and advice. And we need to help businesses adapt and develop to these changing circumstances and to create real opportunities and jobs in rural areas. And linked to that, I think the last thing would be thinking about, just some of Scotland's advantages. We can produce great food. We've got a real opportunity to make Scotland a good food nation. To change how we think about our supply chains, to stop thinking about just exporting whiskey or exporting red meat, but actually starting to create lots of small to medium-sized enterprises, producing really distinctive Scottish produce, eating more of what we produce, producing more of what we eat in Scotland. And we need a Good Food Nation bill to help us do that. And the last one, and it's a personal one, is I think there's real opportunity for Scotland to develop year-round ecotourism and outdoor recreation, make us a destination for that, but of course to do that in a sustainable way that actually protects the very things that very, very many people want to come to Scotland to see and enjoy, all the amazing wildlife and the things we already have. So that would be my starter for 10.
Right, thank you very much. I have posed you all a task at the end, which was to say something about what would be the one thing that you would really want to see in terms of policy or in terms of action, collective action or government action that would take us to a better place for our people and the heart of our countryside by 2030. So can I start with Megan, and we'll go along in,
Okay.
in that order.
I was hoping I would get to go last because then I get to comment on what everyone else says. I think, just going back to the report I talked about at the beginning, I think from the Land Commission's perspective, we've heard a huge amount about the importance of participation of whether it's young people participating or local people being able to participate in decision making. While we have this continued imbalance of power and control over those decision making processes, it's going to be very difficult for local people to properly and meaningfully participate in whichever kind of process it is, whether it's around the development of a local place plan or whether it's around, land use strategies or whichever policy framework. So I think what we really need to do is find some techniques and some tools, whether it's statutory or cultural change, which can rebalance that degree of power at the local level in order for true engagement and empowerment to happen.
Thank you. And to Jack.
Much of what's been said, I think, ensuring, it'll come as no surprise, I'll speak about young people here. But yeah, having young people part of, I think there's been a real shift nationally, young people being involved in national policy making, but I would love to see that really strengthening in local policy making. I think that would be first, and as I mentioned earlier on...
You're only allowed one, but shall I let you get away with it? No, go on. Squeeze in.
Just retaining youth populations and encourage them to invest and be part of the community.
Great, I'm glad I gave you that chance to say that. Callum.
This is part of the same sentence. The point that was made about different classifications of rural is fundamentally important, and that point you made about remote rural is really important, because remote from what? It's so loaded in terms of the kind of connotations there, and I think that needs to be really kind of drawn out. And as well with regard to, I think what needs to change basically is to have land and issues of land reform, which was defined by the Land Reform Review Group in 2014 as measures which influence the ownership and the use of land, which covers pretty much everything, ties into that. And that comes into that gentleman there's point around, one of the aspects anyway, these are contested issues, of course, and one of the things you mentioned was kind of conservation versus development and wind farms and so on. It just illustrates that these are not kind of parenthood and apple pie issues. There are kind of challenges and issues to think about there, which is one of the things we've touched upon all along.
Thank you. And Vicky.
Yeah, I think if I have to pick one, then clearly we need to address what we see as the big challenges of climate change and biodiversity, and whatever our interests. If we don't do those things, then we're all in big trouble, basically. So I think my one would be thinking about how we refocus, reshape the investment we already make into Scotland's rural areas, whether that's our food and farming system, whether that's forestry, whether that's local development through LEADER, which all comes out currently of this same pot of money, and really think about how we spend that in future to really deliver against the outcomes that societally we need to deliver against. And I'm not sure that's what we've been doing with those large amounts of public money that we've been spending for very many years to date. We may have some scope to rethink that. I won't mention. We've had a whole evening without mentioning another word, which I won't mention, which begins with B.
Tonight.
Yes, absolutely. And we take no particular view on that. But that may be an area where we can think about how we repurpose and reshape some of that public investment in our rural areas.
Right. So I would like to close the formal part of the proceedings by thanking Leslie for setting the scene in such a clear and visionary way. Thank you. And also to Chris for your presentation, and the panel for your inputs into what I hope you agree has been a thought-provoking discussion, and there will be many more of them, I'm sure, about rural Scotland. As I said earlier, video and written reports will be produced of the discussion. They'll be published on the Futures Forum website in due course, and we'll email you when these are available. And this discussion will feed into our larger Scotland 2030 programme, which is running through the session. And as part of this, the forum aims to develop aspirational visions of the future, to which tonight I'm sure will contribute. And with them, some of the challenges to MSPs, to the Parliament, and to Scotland more generally on how to embrace challenges and opportunities which lie ahead of us. So, to give everyone a chance to contribute, we will be in touch with you over the coming days to get some thoughts on what you've heard this evening. And the next event in our programme this year will look at the future of urban Scotland. And it will take place, I'm worried about definitions now actually, but anyway, it will take place on Wednesday the 26th of June, and be chaired by my fellow Future Forum Director, Stuart Macmillan MSP. So check out the website for more details. And in the meantime, we have the room until 8. We may push it a tiny bit beyond that, but not much. And so I'd like to invite you to stick around, please, for more informal discussion over some light refreshments. And thank you all very much. Thank you.